Hello, my name is Father Bill Lytle, and I'm Director of Christian Formation at St. George's Episcopal Church in Clifton Park, New York. And this is part 5 of our occasional series entitled C.S. Lewis and the Four Last Things. And we're making our way through the Great Divorce. Now, I do apologize for the lag between the last installment and this one. It just seems that this is the one thing that gets away from me every week. But I haven't given up on it, and I hope that you haven't given up on it either. And so today I'd like to continue with Chapter 5 of The Great Divorce. Well, in Chapter 5, we encounter another one of the important conversations that our narrator overhears throughout the book. This one between the Ghost in Gaiters, this very high-minded and academic bishop, and his young friend who comes down out of the mountain to encounter him and to coax him away from hell and into heaven. Now, there are a few things that I would like to point some attention to in this chapter of the book. The first is the idea of intellectual sin and what it is. The academic ghost seems to be unable to believe that anyone could be held accountable for their sincerely held beliefs. That the content of what one believes doesn't really matter as long as those beliefs were held honestly and heroically. And those are the two words he keeps using to define his theological understandings, which, as we discern from the chapter, rejected many core principles of the Christian faith, including the resurrection. While insisting that the content of what one believes does indeed matter, his young friend also contests the assertion that his beliefs were honest or heroic at all. To be heroic, they would have had to incur some sort of risk. And they didn't. Because they matched so well with the spirit of the age. Apostates and heretics have always been applauded and welcomed by the world. And so when the academic ghost says that he took a fearless stand in denouncing and rejecting the resurrection, his friend reminds him that all that got him were book sales and accolades, and finally his bishopric. And as far as them being honest, his beliefs being honest, his young friend reminds him of how those beliefs developed over time. And I'd like to read that section of the book. "Let us be frank," he says. "Our opinions were not honestly come by. We simply found ourselves in contact with a certain current of ideas and plunged into it because it seemed modern and successful. At college, we just started automatically writing the kind of essays that got good marks, and saying the kind of things that won applause. When, in our whole lives, did we honestly face, in solitude, the one question on which all turned, whether after all the supernatural might not in fact occur? When did we put up one moment's real resistance to the loss of our faith?" If this is meant to be a sketch of the genesis of liberal theology in general, I reply that it is mere libel. "Do you mean to suggest that men like," says the academic ghost, and his friend replies, "I have nothing to do with any generality, nor with any man but you and me. Oh, as you love your own soul, remember. You know that you and I were playing with loaded dice. We didn't want the other to be true. We were afraid of crude salvationism, afraid of a breach with the spirit of the age, afraid of ridicule, afraid, above all, of real spiritual fears and hope." The point that he's making is this: it is neither honest nor heroic to reject the truths of the faith to receive the applause of the age. We have been warned against doing that for centuries, going all the way back to Christ himself. And yet we are also tempted to think exactly what this academic ghost thinks. To think that when we reject what the church has always taught us, we reject what we ourselves once believed, we are somehow taking a stand against tyrannical old ideas, when really what we're doing is acquiescing to the spirit of the age. Far from heroic, it's actually an act of cowardice. The heroic thing to do is always to stand with the truth of Christ, because the truth of Christ is always what the world rejects. The world hated me, said Jesus, and so the world will hate you. And so we should be very concerned if our ideas and our statements, if the books we write and the sermons we preach receive the approval of the world, because Jesus himself never received the approval of the world. These things are not heroic. They merely come from the fear deep inside each of us of being rejected by those in power, being rejected by the in-group, and finding ourselves outcasts from society. The second thing I would like to bring up in this chapter is the idea of what sin does to a person. Now we'll see this more and more as we go through the rest of the Great Divorce, but we begin to see it here. From the very beginning of the chapter, this ghost's intellectual sin led him away from the faith, further and further away from the faith, until he can't come back. Because whatever is left of him to come back is gone. It's been subsumed by his ideas, by his sin. When they first encounter each other at the beginning of the chapter, the ghost in the gaiters refuses to believe that he's been in hell. He's been there all this time, and he has never even realized that he's been in hell. And that's because his rejection of the ideas of heaven and hell had become so a part of him that he was unable to see past it. And as we proceed through the Great Divorce, we'll see that effect of sin more and more displayed. Hell is not a punishment like the ghost in gaiters so violently rejects. It's merely the state of being of those who have been overtaken by their sin. His sin has come so to define him. His rejection of the faith has come to define him so much that even when it's there before his eyes, even when he's standing in hell itself, he can't believe. And that is why the content of belief is so important. That is why it matters. That is why an apostate like this ghost is in hell. Not as a punishment, but because that is where he is chosen to be. And of course we see at the end of the chapter that he chooses to be there. Which brings me to my third point, the idea of freedom, which comes up in this chapter. The ghost begins to toy with the idea of traveling further with his friend into heaven, but he has some stipulation. And one of them is that he'll be useful there, that his talents will be used, and his friend says, no, that won't be the case at all. You won't be useful whatsoever, and you'll only have it revealed to you that you have perverted your talents. And then he says, well, I need to have the free exchange of ideas. This idea of freedom is very important to him. And the young ghost says, well, that's not going to happen at all. You know, your insistence of probing and questioning and skepticism, that has no place here. This is not the place of questions. It's the place of answers. And the academic ghost finds that stultifying. He finds it stagnant. He can't understand how that could possibly be freedom. He wants to hold on to his skepticism. And his young friend tells him, the freedom that you have here is the freedom that a thirsty man has when he's drinking. He has the freedom to drink, but he does not have the freedom to remain thirsty. The freedom that Christ offers us is the freedom to surrender to him and receive what he has promised. But in doing so, by definition, we cannot hold on to anything of ourselves. We will find ourselves transformed. But in order to find our lives, Christ tells us, we have to lose them. We have to be willing to let them go. The freedom of Christ is true freedom, but it also involves the surrender of this life. In the end of the chapter, as I've said, the ghost decides he cannot go. He has to go back to hell to present a paper. He chooses to remain in slavery that he can't recognize, instead of accept the freedom that Christ offers, because he finds it too costly. How many of us are in that same position? How many of us cling to the things of this life, things of this world, and reject the freedom that Christ has offered? That will become a key idea as we encounter more characters in our journey through the Great Divorce. I hope to see you again, and I hope that it's soon. God bless.